let's make sure again, everybody, to speak into the mic clearly so that the YouTube people can hear, and you know, the ghostly YouTube people. And so, go ahead.
I was quite impressed with your presentation last week, and I wasn't quite sure where it was going at one point. And what
neither was I.
And that's okay, because at one point I listened and I thought, what you basically were talking about, this is what I saw. You were embodying mind, body, and spirit and bringing it all together as one. And you touch on it a bit tonight when you talk about truth. This is where we need to go, right? And I know you say be positive and all that, and yeah, that's right, I agree. It's scary what's going on right now. However, we have the power to stay in the positive. What you talked about last week, you talked about using our intuition, which I consider our higher self, using consciousness, and you made reference, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you held your hand, and you talked about emotions and bringing intellect on top. And when you said emotions, everything just lit up for me, because I'm thinking that's our heart chakra. That's what combines our lower self, our physical being, the material stuff, all the stuff that doesn't really motivate us, with our higher self. And when you talked about emotion, I wanted to talk about the emotion of love. And I find so many people are terrified. It's a 4-letter word, I know, but it doesn't have to be bad.
Okay, so I remember why, when I talked to you last week, why I wanted you to ask this question. So, okay, so I've talked a lot in this lecture series about truth. And I think there's a battle in the biblical stories all the way through between love and truth in terms of their primacy. And I've concentrated a lot on truth in my own thinking, but and it's hard to talk about love because it's a word that people have mouthed to death. As soon as you start talking about love, then people should just go into a different room and not listen to you, because it can get sappy and new agey just like that. And I don't like that at all. But it still is something that has to be contended with. And I think, so I've been trying to conceptualize, let's say, what this covenant might constitute. And I think the love part, so here's this. So, there's this book by Goethe called Faust, and it's in 2 volumes, Faust 1 and Faust 2, logically enough. One was written much later than the other, and Faust basically sells his soul to the devil for knowledge. And the devil in Faust is Mephistopheles. And Mephistopheles is quite a well-developed character. And Goethe has Mephistopheles say what he's about, which is really quite cool. So it's like the adversary of the world, evil itself, gets a chance to speak and make its case. And Goethe thought this was so important that he actually had Mephistopheles announce himself once in Faust 1, and then using the same words, phrased differently, again in part 2. And it really struck me. And so what Mephistopheles says is that the world is such a charterhouse of suffering and destruction that it would be better if it never existed. And so that what he's working to is to bring existence to an end, because it is not justified by its suffering. It's like it's an argument very similar to the argument that's made by Ivan Karamazov. Thank you. Russians, you can't pronounce them or live with them. You can't. But he's an atheist and does a very good job of detailing out the atheist argument, or maybe an anti-theist argument. And he's arguing with his brother Alyosha, who's a monastic novitiate, who's a very good guy, but not an intellect. Ivan's an intellect and a very powerful one. And he basically tells Alyosha that all of the cosmos isn't worth the suffering of one child. He tells this story about this, and Dostoevsky took this from a newspaper, about this parents that locked their 4-year-old daughter in an outhouse overnight, and she screamed about it until she froze to death. And so Dostoevsky used that argument. He tied that into Ivan's anti-theist argument against Alyosha. It's a very, very powerful argument. The Brothers Karamazov is an absolutely mind-boggling, amazing book. I would highly recommend it. And so that's the Mephistophelian perspective. Mephistophelian perspective is that being itself is so corrupt that it shouldn't exist. So then you think, okay, well, fair enough. That's a decent argument. It's understandable. But the problem comes when you try to implement that. And what happens when you implement it, as far as I can tell, you adopt that Mephistophelian attitude of bitterness and resentment and destruction, is that you make all the suffering that you're complaining about far worse. And I think that's what at the base of things in the 20th century, is that there was a powerful movement among humanity to bring being itself to a halt. You know, what culminated in the development of the hydrogen bomb. And the high probability for at many periods of time that we were going to do something permanent and fatal. Which seems like a bad idea. It seems like a bad idea. Well, so what's the opposite of the Mephistophelian attitude? And I think the opposite of that is what's presented in the biblical stories in the guise of love. And that is the wish that things would be good. It's something like that. That's what love is, I think, is that it's the attempt to orient yourself towards making things better. And it's predicated on something like a deep appreciation for being despite its suffering and deficiencies, and maybe a decision that you're going to act to bring about things, to move things towards the good. And I think that's the thing that sets the parameters of the aim. It's the opposite of the Mephistophelian attitude. It's like to work towards the betterment of being because you've decided that you're going to open your heart to existence, something like that. And it's within that framework that truth takes place, I think, because truth has to serve something. It can serve truth, but it has to be bounded inside something, and I think that that's what it's bounded inside. So
what I was going to refer to with that was David Hawkins wrote Power versus Force, and he put it on a quantifiable scale, all different emotions. He called it consciousness, and he put love at 528 hertz. He put shame at 20. I'm not sure if I've got these 100% right. Guilt, I think, at 30, fear at 50, and it shows you how far the people who are really knocked down have to get to love. And I'm thinking if we could quantify love on a term, it means different things to everybody, and rightly so. But can we get to that frequency? And if you look at the solfeggio notes, you know the musical notes? Have you heard?
I'm afraid I'm gonna ask you to stop if you would, because I should go to another question. Thank you very much. Okay, let's